Just wanted to share something regarding my recent expedition to California. I had set off on an exciting adventure up north, up to the Shasta Trinity National Forest, California. Coming all the way from Arizona, this marked my first trip on this terrain. I had reached in the afternoon, pitched my tent, and spent the evening exploring my surroundings. Apparently, it was the last day which awakened my senses. As darkness started setting in, I was reclining indoors. Uncle had been hunting around these parts with a few of his friends around 4 years prior. One night, while they were sleeping inside their tent, they were startled awake by the thudding noises and heavy breathing near their camp. It turned out later, to their horror, it was a mountain lion roaming the very same camp. This story was hovering around in my mind while I was trying to retire to sleep that night. All of a sudden, a wave of extreme fear swept over me. I was instantly alerted, my senses heightened. I froze still, straining my ears to perceive any definitive sound outside my tent. At that moment, I heard what sounded like the soft crunching of dried leaves, and the sound of something heavy moving about nearby. Almost imperceptible at first, but the closer it got, the more evident it became. The sounds were unmistakably nearby now, too close for comfort, in fact. In tandem with the noise was a breathing pattern that I can only describe as a low grating. It was not like the typical noises of the night. It felt out of place. Furthermore, it felt threatening. My mind jumped to the worst possibilities. Fear seized me for a few long moments as I envisaged a mountain lion, like the one in my uncle's tale, prowling our camp. Mustering up the courage, I sat up quietly, trying to be as silent as possible in that hostile midnight. In the dark, I fumbled to locate my glasses and clutched my rifles that I had brought along, just in case. Things felt like they were moving in a slow motion as I gathered my bearings, preparing for what was outside. But my fear and dread were overwhelming. I decided to turn on my flashlight to see what was out there when everything went quiet. The noises ceased and an unsettling silence dropped over the campsite. It was as if the forest held its breath. It was in that moment that my anxiety surprisingly disappeared. However, I was not at peace for long. I suddenly heard a low growl, followed by the snap of a branch. The growl was unlike those of the usual woodland inhabitants. It felt more profound and full of angst. I considered for a bit to call out into the darkness. Perhaps it was just a wandering camper, but my gut disagreed. Something felt wrong. I didn't want to startle whatever was out there, just in case it decided to come my way. I am a seasoned hunter, but I'm also smart enough to know not to provoke an unknown entity, especially one that seems to be lurking in the dark around my campsite. I quickly dressed, muted my flashlight, and slowly unzipped my tent. I crept out, trying not to make any sudden noises that might alarm the entity. I cautiously moved around the tent, scanning the surroundings for any sign of movements. With my heart nearly beating out of my chest, I made my way towards the noise, feeling an odd mix of dread and curiosity. About 40 yards east of my tent, amid a cluster of tall redwoods, I noticed something was off. It wasn't an out-of-place noise, but an anomaly I spotted on the damp trail leading back towards a narrow, winding logging road designated as Road 984. Road 984 Trailhead, as you might recall, is about 2 miles away from the mountain gate, which served as my base camp location. It was a set of tracks etched deeply into the soft mud. The tracks were of an unusual kind, unlike anything I'd seen in my entire hunting career. They were enormous, almost 18 inches in length and 8 inches wide. I could clearly make out the toe prints, a solid 5 embedded deeply into the mud. It had been drizzling lightly the evening before, typical of Northern California, so the ground was still soft. These tracks were in great shape, without any traces of water collecting in them. They appeared fresher than one could expect in such weather. Clearly, they were recent. Considering the odd hours and the chilling circumstances, it did not take me long to draw the conclusion. Even though I've grown up in and around the hunting folks who are filled with stories of the unexplained and the wild, I hardly paid any heed to them. But this was no time for skepticism. I felt an unusual thrill seeing those tracks, but surprisingly, my fear was replaced by a strange fascination. I quickly returned to my tent, grabbed my camera, and returned, half expecting the tracks to have disappeared like a figment of my imagination. But they were still there, very much distinctly visible. The moment of truth was then, and for the record, the pictures were out of the ordinary as well. You can guess where I'm heading with this. I felt a sting, remembering the growl and the tracks. I couldn't help but feel I was not alone in that moment. A chilling realization struck me. Could it be that I had stumbled upon Bigfoot, a creature that was considered to be most of folklore than reality? Many in our community have shared stories of encountering this thing, but as an ardent skeptic, I had dismissed them as after-dinner chat, mere figments of overexcited imagination. But standing in the silence of the night, faced with potential evidence of this thing, I was filled with a sensation. My skepticism confronted reality. The encounter was alarmingly surreal. Anyway, I wanted to share this experience with you as it not only defied my beliefs, but also gave me a whole new perspective. I wanted to share something strange that happened during our recent camping trip. We were at the Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park, located in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We pitched our tent at the Union Bay Modern Campground, precisely at Site 64. I always prefer to choose the most remote sites available to escape the hubbub. Also, the spot had loads of trees offering ideal coverage, kind of enhancing your sense of isolation. One morning, around 2, I was jolted awake. My partner seemed oddly tense. When I questioned, she confessed that she had heard unusual sounds echoing from the trees that made her very uncomfortable. Usually, I would soothe her concerns and persuade her to sleep again. But this time, even I was intrigued. Seconds later, I realized why. An ensemble of bizarre, continuous hoots from owls filled the air. The sound seemed oddly rhythmic and was soon accompanied by a chorus of coyote howls. Suddenly, we heard what sounded like each bird in the forest awakening and joining this orchestration. The harmony went on for some 30-odd seconds, and then abruptly, all went silent. Now, I grew up around here. I knew there was something out of the ordinary happening. And before I could process the strange sounds, we heard a heavy, crunching footstep echoing right near us. Thump, thump, thump. You could hear twigs and branches snapping as something very heavy moved through the woods. It dawned on me that the footsteps were bipedal, so it was a very big person. But no human would venture these thick woods in the dead of night. And why? It's unlikely that they would intentionally make noise like this to alarm others, potentially carrying firearms. Besides, navigating in near blindness through this rugged terrain would be ardently challenging. Further, the dense canopy and undergrowth would render it practically impossible for hunting, day or night. Moreover, common woodland animals such as deers, bear, or smaller creatures were out of the question, given the weight of these steps. Now, some people have told stories about the Porcupine Mountains Shadow Man, supposedly a towering dark figure often glimpsed in the wilderness around the campgrounds. I've heard these tales growing up, and although spooky, never really took them seriously. But what was happening at this chilling hour had me and my partner on edge. The twigs snapping, the leaves rustling, and the overwhelming silence of the woods had our hearts pounding. The sounds felt like they were inching closer towards us. We kept our flashlights off, not wanting to draw any undesired attention. Anxiously, we huddled together, waiting, hoping for the sounds to pass by. The suspense was excruciating, yet the adrenaline was oddly exhilarating. Perhaps, we thought, this was some prank pulled off by other campers. But the amount of risk involved, just for the sake of a prank, seemed ludicrous. When the sounds had stopped, without warning, a shadow hurriedly passed by our tent, a hulking tall figure dwarfing the trees around us. I could feel a chilling gust of wind that came with it. Neither of us dared to move, let alone make a peep. The next morning, we found large prints around our campsite, aligned in a bipedal pattern. It was then we realized we might not have been the victims of a tasteless prank after all. Possibly, we had an unexpected visitor who people often call the Shadow Man. We surveyed the entire area, footprints encircled the campsite, and then veered off into the woods. They were deep, around 2 inches deep in some spots, indicating something very heavy. At that point, we couldn't explain what we had witnessed. I'm no cryptid enthusiast, but the thought of encountering something unexplainable and outright strange had me rattled. We quickly packed up our camp. The usually serene and comforting woods now seemed ominous. We had shared our experience with a ranger, but he dismissed it. We knew what we had heard. Those were unmistakably bipedal footsteps. They were too rhythmic and too loud to be any bear. A few people, older rangers, they did mention the tall Shadow Man. Now to this day, I remember the feeling of anxiety and fright mixed with excitement. It's one of those incidents that just makes you question what's really out there in the wilderness that are we yet to understand. Well, that's my story. I've written this out more to try and make sense of what happened. Something happened that night, I'm sure. It was just not our imagination. I hope this finds you well. I wanted to share a disturbing experience I had last weekend. I'm currently working as a nanny in New York, and have had the privilege of staying in the family's cabin located in a secluded area of the Adirondacks. This is a cabin in a picturesque location, but its isolation does make it unsettling at times. This is the kind of place where the closest neighbor is a good 40-minute hike away through the forest, and aside from that, it's just miles and miles of wilderness. So last Friday, the parents decided they would have a date night in the city, leaving me in charge of their 2 boys. The cabin is flanked by a smaller guest house, where I was to spend the night. The schedule for the day was meant to be a fun exploration of the nearby woods, followed by a drive to pick up my partner from a local bus station. The thought of taking the kids into the forest alone did make me a tad anxious, despite having done it a couple of times with the parents. As we ventured, I began feeling uncomfortable, like I was being watched. The birds seemed agitated, fluttering about and making alarmed calls at our approach. This was odd because we were still far from their nesting areas. Additionally, we kept hearing distinct heavy thudding sounds as though a large animal was nearby. Given we were in bear territory, the sounds were strange, to say the least. The forest trail led us to a secluded pond, and here's where I faltered. Across the pond, approximately 60 feet from us, was a man, absolutely naked, seemingly oblivious to the chilly temperature, and all wet, like he had been swimming. Noticeably disoriented, he got to his feet and started pacing erratically near the water, appearing to be trapped by the barrier of the pond that lay between us. After watching him for a few anxious moments, I ushered the kids away from the pond and made our way back to the trail. The feeling of being watched never really leaving. We picked up my partner from the bus stop without any further incident and returned to the cabin, with the night drawing in. I managed to get the boys settled in for their dinner, while my partner and I decided to rest for a while in the cozy warmth of the cabin. The peace was disrupted when the front door of the cabin suddenly slammed open, the sound echoing in the room. Initially, our thoughts were that it could have been one of the parents, but when we investigated, there was nobody. The door had been securely shut, so it was hard to believe it was the wind, although we had no other logical explanation for it. In an attempt to soothe our jangled nerves, we huddled in the living room, trying to engage the kids with the story, while strange noises drifted outside. Scratching, skittering. It was like something was scrabbling to come out. Rodents were known, of course, to be here, but it was different. Dismissing it as probably just a fox or a raccoon, we focused our attention back to the boys. It was around midnight when things started to escalate. The noises, at first, are barely noticeable, and they begin to intensify. The sounds were no longer just scratches or skittering noises, but more like low moans, growls, and thuds, a freaky, almost human-like groan. The kids, still awake, were fearful. We decided it was best to check the guest house to ensure nothing or no one had broken in. As my partner and I approached the guest house, we noticed the main door was ajar. This was unusual, considering we had securely locked it earlier in the day. We cautiously entered, only to find the place completely in disarray. Our luggage was strewn about, untouched food had been mauled, and the main window was shattered. Nervous and scared, we decided to return to the main house and call the police. While we waited for the police to arrive, we stayed up all night, the noises never ceasing. It was around dawn when the sheriff arrived, and we explained the situation, and he assured us that it was probably a bear, and that they had similar incidents reported in the past. The part about the disoriented naked man made him frown, but he brushed it off as probably some intoxicated man who lost his way. Off the record, however, he mentioned old rumors about an unusual creature living nearby, whatever that was. Whether it was truly a bear or something more sinister, I couldn't say. I'm just relieved that we're back in the busy city, and away from the uncomfortable solitude of the Adirondacks. To date, I don't know if the naked man and the strange occurrences at the cabin were connected in any way. It might be that our minds were playing tricks on us that night, but the clawed marks on the guest house door, the destroyed window, and the lingering feeling of terror says otherwise. I hope this bizarre experience of mine serves as a cautionary tale. Stay safe. I wanted to tell you about this odd thing that happened just 2 nights ago. I was up until around 3 a.m., working on projects since everything is so quiet and there's no distraction. I like the stillness of the night, but this time, things turned out differently. Do you know the sound that a feather makes when it brushes against paper? Well, I heard exactly that soft noise in the background, the kind of sounds you don't usually notice in the clamor of the day. At that moment, it, however, became very prominent. Now, I won't say it did not startle me. It did. And the strangest thing was, once the sound became noticeable, it kept getting louder. I can't say it was frightful, but was definitely strange. It was as if my ears had suddenly amplified their hearing capabilities. The sound kept amplifying to the extent where it gave the illusion of being inside the room. And all of a sudden, it reached a point where it became almost deafening. I know it sounds crazy, but do you remember the time we were trying to reconfigure that old vintage radio, and it gave a crackling, distorted sound before it tuned into an actual station? Well, that's what happened next. The deafening sound converted into a similar crackling noise as if there was a radio frequency interference. The room was filled with these distorted sounds that sounded strangely digital. What makes this entire experience more bizarre is how abruptly everything returned to silence. I can only think, what just happened? It felt like a few minutes of an alternate reality, or an out-of-body experience. This might sound insane, but the silence which followed was so profound that it took me a moment to register. When I did, I decided it was worth investigating. Look, I live alone. Who else could it be? I left no turn unturned, examined every corner of my house, but there was no sign of any intrusion or any electronic gadget that might have made the noise. No radio was on. I had no devices with speakers nearby. And for the record, I never had a feather in my place. But the sound happened inside my room. I was certain about it. Stress, I thought, but wasn't sure. I'm 34. I've never had such experiences before. Neither did I discuss with anyone, not even with my parents. Writing this to you is the first time I am discussing this. While the event might explain to be a figment of the brain overworked, it was undeniably odd. That night, I did not start working again. It was a blend of fear and curiosity that kept me awake for the rest of the night. The experience was nothing short of an auditory mystery. The next day, everything was normal, and it's been 2 days now without any repetition. But to tell you the truth, every silent night now piques my curiosity. Part of me wants to undergo that experience again just so I could capture it somehow. Anyway, that's about it. I'm curious to know your thoughts on this auditory experience. I've been investigating and documenting strange Bigfoot occurrences since the mid-1980s. Similar phenomena, like the one I've recently discussed, involves a tiny, powerful light followed by Bigfoot vocalizations and has been noted in numerous states, including here in Texas. So I wanted to share an incident that occurred in March of 2020 near Huntsville, in the rural region of Walker County, Texas. It was in the wee hours of the morning. A local resident was awake, gazing out the window, when he noticed an odd sight. He claims he saw what appeared to be a smaller than expected Bigfoot creature crossing the open field towards the dense forestry. Following the thing's departure into the woodlands, an intriguing event took place. After about 3 seconds, a vibrant sphere of light, approximately 4 inches in diameter, materialized abruptly at the exact spot where the Bigfoot creature had vanished earlier. According to the witness, the sphere was as bright as staring straight into a high-beam flashlight, located roughly about 4 feet above the ground. The glowing object then began to move, covering a short distance over approximately 3 seconds before completely disappearing. However, this wasn't the end. Around 5 seconds later, the light reappeared about 10 feet away from its initial position. At this time, the small sphere emitted an intense beam of light into the surrounding area. The beam had reached an area of about 12 feet. The beam was visible for a brief period before it dissipated and did not reappear. From 2019, there have been an increasing number of unusual cryptid encounters reported in Texas, especially in Walker County. The Bigfoot phenomenon has many odd aspects, unknown or unheard of by the general public. Shortly after this occurrence, a series of chilling vocalizations broke out, classic Bigfoot calls that echoed unmistakably through the night. Understandably, the eyewitness had been startled by these bizarre sightings and the subsequent sounds. He had been living in this area for over a decade but had never experienced anything like it before. It wasn't until the next morning that the true nature of the incident emerged. In the daylight, the eyewitness ventured to the location where he had first spotted this thing. He discovered a set of well-defined tracks leading into the woods, undoubtedly those of a Bigfoot, and more perplexing, near the spot where the strange light had glowed the night before, he unearthed a weird circular pattern of flattened grass. You're all familiar with my work, and know I go where the stories lead me. This unusual report was sufficiently intriguing that I felt a compulsion to investigate in person. I arrived in Walker County a few days later and was to be able to examine the first-hand evidence. I can attest that the tracks and the flattened grass are as authentic as per the description. The witness is still living in the area, and since that eventful night, there have been no further sightings or incidents. I continue to confer and keep tabs with him to stay updated. This strange thing adds another facet to the Bigfoot phenomenon and makes one wonder, what is the connection with the glowing spheres of light seen in so many similar cases? As always, I urge you to remain open-minded and observant. The unknown is vast. Our understanding is very limited. This report from Walker County, Texas, provides further evidence that we are yet at the precipice of understanding these remarkable creatures and the phenomena surrounding them. This happened when I was in high school, around 1974. We lived right on the outskirts of Scranton, Pennsylvania, in what could still be considered a fairly rural area. My bedroom was on the ground floor of our house, with a window that faced the forested backyard. It was early, maybe around 4 or 5 in the morning, when I woke up feeling thirsty. The moonlight streamed through the open window, barely providing enough light to see inside the room, and I remember the smell of wet leaves. Directly across the yard, about halfway between our house and the woodline, stood our shed. It was a little run down and quite old, but we used it to store tools and other farm equipment. Near the shed, we had kept a rabbit's hutch. It was actually my sister's, but she insisted it should be kept outside just due to the smell. One night, I saw what appeared to be a silhouette of a person right next to the hutch. It was a tall figure, but unusually thin in proportion to its height. The most bizarre thing about this figure was its head, which appeared oddly elongated, almost like that of a horse, with a long face and tapering ears. As the figure bent down towards the hutch, I felt a shiver running down my spine as it occurred to me that this was not a person. I was completely paralyzed. It was like I had forgotten how to move. My heart was about to pound against my ribcage, nearly coming out of my chest. The figure was still kneeling next to the hutch, and I could see it making some motion towards the hutch. It was then I saw a glimmer of something shiny, perhaps a tool or a knife from our shed. The figure was slicing the wire mesh of the hutch. Its movements were quick and fluid, like this wasn't the first time it had done this. It reached its hand into the hutch as it pulled out. I could see the rabbit squirming. With one swift movement, the figure did something with the knife, and suddenly, the rabbit was still. It dropped the rabbit back into the hutch and then disappeared. All of this happened in a matter of minutes since I woke up. I can't tell you how long I lay there, too petrified to move. It was only then, when I saw the dawn slowly approaching, that I managed to get up. I told my parents about my experience, and they nearly laughed in my face. But they did agree to check out the rabbit's hutch. What's your take on it? When daylight eventually came, my father and I went out to check on the hutch. Initially, we thought rabbits were just sleeping, but as we came closer, a surreal wave of realization took over us. The links were indeed cut, and the rabbit was lying lifeless in the hutch. The tool which was used to cut the wire was from our shed, since I distinctly remember the shed being locked before we went off to bed. The discovery left me alarmed. After this incident occurred, similar strange incidents started happening with an alarming frequency all around our property. The shed was found unlocked in the mornings, and some of our tools were misplaced. The sound of something tearing through the vegetation like a large animal, but on two legs, was heard more often. My parents were convinced that something was happening. I began looking into local lore and stumbled upon an old Native American legend, specifically in this area. The legend told about night walkers, beings that live in the forest and only come out at night. It was said that they were harbingers of death and terrible fortune. I can't help but feel some sort of correlation, and maybe there's nothing at all. Maybe this is just some sicko who enjoys getting their kicks out of doing stuff around our property. I don't know. But regardless, I'll let you be the judge. My close friend and I are pretty hardcore hiking enthusiasts. Last year, around the end of August, we decided to put our brand new hiking boots to test in the dramatic Sapphire region of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Just to give you some background, the Sierra Nevadas are a remote area with peaks rising to more than 14,000 feet, adorned with pristine turquoise blue lake sides, wildflowers, and dense forests. Most of the terrains are off-grid, and usually it's awfully quiet. So back to our adventure. We drove up this bumpy trail path on our 4x4, our goal being this hidden waterfall within the woods whose beauty was talked about only by some friends of mine. We had marked out this amazing spot by the falls to camp at for the night. Now, you need to remember, despite it being late August, the temperatures can dip pretty low at night just because we're up pretty high, sometimes approaching near freezing under the cascading waterfall with almost zero human presence. We reached the falls by dusk, set up our hammock camp by the cliffside overlooking the falls. Pure magic, just hard to put into words. The first night we were there, it was a freaky sort of calm. The only sounds we could hear were the crashing waterfall, our own breath, and the occasional hoots from the woods nearby. We must have fallen asleep somewhere past midnight. Now this is where it starts to get interesting. As we were steeped in our dreams, we were jolted awake around 3 a.m. by a series of loud crashing noises and what sounded like a dreadful shrieking, something similar to the howl of a bobcat, only much, much louder. In our daze and confusion, all we could think of was packing up our camp and getting as far away as possible from whatever that noise was. We practically fled through the woods back to our truck, leaving half our stuff behind. So the next day, we took a deep breath, gathered our courage, returned to the campsite to retrieve our belongings. Our surprise grew when we saw the spot we had left in such a hurry the night before. Everything was untouched. No signs of animal activity, no signs of whatever could have made those noises. The waterfall was still cascading onto the stark boulders, oblivious to the drama that ensued. As we're heading back, we ran into a forest officer. We shared our experience expecting some sort of logical explanation, maybe a bear, perhaps. But his bewildered look told us that he was as clueless as we were. His only advice to us was to refrain from night camping in that area. Parts of the trail were known to be treacherous and unexplored, he told us. We returned with a lighter backpack and a very, very heavy sense of bewilderment. Up until now, during all of our hiking trips, we've come across aggressive raccoons, defensive bobcats, reclusive coyotes, and quite a few times, mountain lions. But nothing closely matched what we had heard that night. This was something truly unexplainable, and it has marked our memories in a way that no other trip has. Even a year down the line, we still find ourselves questioning what could have really happened. Was it an animal marking its territory, or maybe a local prank, or something more mysterious? Guess we'll never know.